Hello, I'm Joe Wren from WFIU News, and welcome to a special discussion from the Indiana University School of Global and International Studies. In the next hour, we'll focus on foreign policy and security challenges the next president will inherit. I'm joined today by 5 panelists. Adam Liff is an assistant professor at the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures. He's an expert on security in the Asia-Pacific region. Clemence Pino is an assistant professor of international studies. She's an expert on conflict and humanitarian intervention. Fred Kate is vice president for research at Indiana University, professor of law at the IU School of Law, and a senior fellow at the Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research. He specializes in information privacy and security law. Emma Gilligan is an associate professor of international studies who has studied Russia extensively, particularly regarding human rights. She is also the author of Defending Human Rights in Russia. And Lee Feinstein is dean for the School of Global and International Studies. In his career, he has worked as a national security director to Hillary Clinton during her 2008 presidential campaign, senior foreign policy advisor to President Barack Obama during the general election, and he was President Obama's first U.S. ambassador to Poland. We also have audience members with us in the SGIS building who can submit questions for our panel. But if you're listening online or on the radio, we would love to hear from you too. You can submit your questions or comments on Twitter at WFIU News or on our website, WFIUnews.org, and you can also email us at news@indianapublicmedia.org. So let's start with kind of a generic general question, and Adam will maybe start here and kind of just quickly go down the line so everyone has a chance to get started. You know, there's been a lot of talk this election season about international organizations, NAFTA, NATO. Trump in particular has talked about not immediately coming to the aid of allied countries, and he's even threatened to pull out of NAFTA. So how are these countries reacting, and then maybe what are some of the long-term implications of these conversations? Adam, let's get us started.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Joe. It's wonderful to be here. I think that as far as we know, based on statements made so far in the campaign, Asia policy, U.S. Asia policy, has the potential to be one of the major foreign policy fault lines for the election, but also once the next president takes office. As far as it concerns Hillary Clinton's approach to the region, we have a lot of data on which to make informed judgments. Most importantly, she was Secretary of State during the first administration of Barack Obama, and she was one of the key architects of the so-called rebalance to the region. So we have a good sense of what she'll do, value alliances, where she'll ultimately come down on free trade agreements remains to be seen. But that's in stark contrast to at least some of the statements coming out of the Trump campaign, in particular, as you noted, on alliances. U.S. alliance policy since the early post-war period has been largely bipartisan and has been fairly consistent over time with moderate changes at the edges. But as far as what Trump seems to be proposing, he's certainly a bit more of a wild card and could possibly represent a major disjuncture in the U.S. approach to the region. And that's in at least 3 ways. The skepticism of alliances often says that we're being ripped off by our allies and seems to view alliances in what might be characterized as relatively narrow economic transactional terms. Obviously, this makes our allies a little bit nervous because the actual rationale for the alliances over time has been much greater than that. This is not charity. This is from the perspective of what is in the U.S. national interest as well. And so there's a mutually supportive atmosphere in both capitals in support of those alliances. Also, potentially reversing decades of U.S. counterproliferation policy by saying during the debates that, oh, of course, Japan, South Korea, maybe they should get nuclear weapons. That also makes both parties within those countries, but others in the region nervous. And then, of course, TPP. Trump's far more likely to be far more skeptical of free trade agreements, which also makes allies that have invested a lot in supporting these agreements very nervous.
Okay, let's get some more of the panel. Clemence?
Yeah, I mean, I would second in the sense that Trump is definitely a wild card. I focus on South Sudan and Africa in general. In that regard, I think everyone is wondering who is going to appoint in his team, especially when it comes to the Secretary of State. So yeah, we'll see. In regards to Clinton, I don't foresee that a lot is going to change in terms of foreign policy.
Fred, you want to join us?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you know, I specialize a great deal in cybersecurity, and I think one of the challenges that the next president's going to inherit is this extremely unstable environment with regard to cyber. And it's going to be an enormous challenge because not only do we not have a clear position nationally, but it's not an area in which we have a lot of international agreements either. We don't have a lot of organizations that have reached a concerted view on cyber. And so I think our allies are, just to echo many of the earlier comments, a little concerned at the notion of a president who might not be working with them to try to develop norms. On the other hand, I think some of the provocative language we've seen, particularly from the Trump campaign, has in some ways caused some voters to say, well, that's terrific. That's what we need, is a stronger way of dealing with people who are threatening us in cyber. Some people have been very concerned that President Obama has been a little too reticent, that he's been much more sort of a wait and see, let's see if we can work this out diplomatically, let's see if we can talk our way through it. And in that sense, I think either a President Hillary Clinton or a President Donald Trump would likely be a little more aggressive in the way that they deal with these issues, whether they go it alone or whether they do it in partnership with others.
Emma?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think I can comment specifically on Russia and our relationship with Russia and the importance of these international institutions like NATO, like the European Union, and the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It seems to me that what either president would be inheriting is we need to reinforce and refresh, I think, that transatlantic partnership. I think certainly they've been trying to do that with the sanctions regime against Russia in the last few years since the annexation of Crimea. But it seems to me that those relationships need to be refreshed, and I think that Hillary Clinton would certainly be a person who, as far as I can see and as far as I can understand, who would be invested in re-establishing and reinvigorating those relationships going forward, particularly in light of how Russia's behaving in eastern Ukraine, for example. Those relationships have become important, and she will have to cope with the fact that there's divisions within Europe, right, about these institutions, that there are new sets of policymakers, younger policymakers who aren't necessarily linked to those older institutions. So I think that that will be a fairly significant challenge for whoever's in place going forward.
Lee, would you like to chime in?
Sure. Every president addresses a set of issues and moves them to off the front burner and buy some time for his successor. And then every president also inherits a range of problems, and that will be the case this time around as well. And in the category of things that arguably, at least from my perspective, have been addressed to a certain extent, just to give two examples. One is Iran, which will require close monitoring, but the President Obama has taken a significant move with the agreement, nuclear deal with Iran, essentially a trade, lifting of sanctions for nuclear restraint, monitored nuclear restraint by Tehran, that sets a course for the future. And if the president decides to respect and honor that agreement and monitor it, that problem is in a certain kind of a foreign policy box. The second issue would be, for example, climate. And the Paris Accord, which President Obama took the lead on and which came to conclusion recently, that's another area where the way ahead is pretty well defined, and it's an issue that the next president won't have to address right away. And the second category, it's a long list, and a lot of them have been discussed already. One that hasn't been raised so far is on Syria, and more broadly in the crisis in the Middle East. The next president is going to have to decide whether to continue the current policy or whether to pursue a policy of greater ambition by the United States. the Syria crisis has had an impact not only on the crisis in the region, but has spilled over and had an impact really globally, particularly in Europe, as the refugees spilling into Europe has created tremendous political upheaval in Europe, created tremendous pressures on the future of the European Union, and contributed mightily to the decision of British voters to vote against staying in the European Union, and to a rise of intolerance and populism really throughout Europe, and arguably with an impact on the United States as well. So those are issues in the inbox. I guess what I would say, though, in addition to the long list of foreign policy problems, is a more fundamental one that any president is going to have to confront, and that is the fundamental lack of agreement, whoever is elected next month, on what this country's role in the world ought to be. And several of my colleagues have raised that, but President Obama's ability to carry out a foreign policy was hobbled by the stiff opposition he received from Congress and the Senate in particular. The ability of the United States to negotiate treaties that require congressional approval or ratification is close to zero right now. It's been 20 years since the United States ratified a multilateral agreement. And this applies in the area of nuclear arms control and non-proliferation, as well as trade. So that has an important impact on not only the president's ability to conduct foreign policy, but also on how US allies and others in the world view the United States' ability to project its influence.
So let's take this more into what we've been seeing a lot more in the news lately about cybersecurity. We've heard allegations of cyber attacks from China and Russia, in particular, Russia being accused of stealing and leaking information from the Democratic Party. Fred, maybe we can start with you, and then any of you, please feel free to just go ahead and jump in. How concerned should we be about possible state-sponsored cyber attacks during this election time?
Yeah, I think we should be concerned. Let me say, I don't think we should just be concerned about it during the election. I think we should be concerned about it more broadly. So speaking specifically to the election, what we've seen has been a pattern of attacks. We've seen attacks against at least 4 states we know of, one of which has not been identified publicly yet. But Florida, Illinois, and Arizona have all had attacks against their voter registration databases, attacks against the Democratic National Committee and the related Congressional Campaign Committee, and attacks against individuals that have resulted in, for example, Colin Powell's emails and so forth being made public, all of which seem to have Russian fingerprints on them. And of course, we don't know for certain, and the people who might know for certain aren't in a position to tell us in detail because it's classified. Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of things we look at to know that. We look at the type of code, the type of attack, its relation to past attacks. We look at the potential motive, who benefits from these attacks. So if the question is, do we think the election is going to be somehow fundamentally altered? Could Vladimir Putin cause somebody to be elected other than who was already going to be elected? I guess the good news is we have such an incredibly archaic voting system. The answer is probably no. It's highly distributed. It's run typically by counties. Almost none of it is accessible online. On the other hand, could President Putin or could the intelligence agencies working for President Putin create a sense of distrust in the election, a sense of uncertainty, which at this point is also being aided by at least one candidate saying, if I don't win, you'll know the election's been stolen. That absolutely could happen. And that actually appears more consistent, and again, my colleagues would undoubtedly know better than I, but with past Russian practices, where we've seen efforts to infiltrate elections in Ukraine, in Western European countries, and elsewhere, sort of moving towards the United States, not necessarily in a way to pick the winner, but in a way to destabilize the sense of confidence in the election. So let me stop there. I don't know if you
Yeah, I think that you can see a pattern of that, certainly in Ukraine during the Orange Revolution, during the Red Revolution in Georgia, and again in trying to force the elections in eastern Ukraine, for example, and in Chechnya, for example. So there has been a pattern of it, and I would agree that it's sort of a psychological weapon. that has destabilized many of these places, or attempts to destabilize them psychologically. I don't know how effective they've been. Certainly in Ukraine, they weren't effective during the Orange Revolution.
I'm myself not an expert on cyber. I'll defer to Fred on those issues. But as far as it concerns the U.S.-China bilateral relationship, in the last few years, cyber issues have absolutely emerged as a major point of friction in the larger bilateral relationship. It's been a major driver of tensions, and I think from the U.S. side, there are three major issues. One is industrial espionage, the other is military espionage, and the third is the possibility that in the event of a conflict or a crisis, that some critical infrastructure might be attacked. And if I can just extract one larger point from this, I think in the wider discourse on cybersecurity, it's important to differentiate between three really different issues. One is cyber crime. Think about maybe your bank account getting hacked by a criminal who then sells that information for a profit. Cyber espionage, which is just traditional espionage between states, except in the cyber domain. And then cyber warfare, which is either attacks designed to destroy either cyber or physical infrastructure, cross-domain attacks, or ones with political coercive intent. And so I just make the point that when we're discussing it, I think it's important to separate those three out.
So Fred, no cyber attacks, but maybe hanging chads again?
Yes, exactly. There's so many ways in which you could destabilize a U.S. election, as we well know. And frankly, that's part of what we worry about in cyber in general. And that is, we often talk about a sort of combined cyber and kinetic attack. And in military parlance, that might be a cyber attack combined with, tanks coming over the border. But I think more realistically, it's recognizing that a lot of US infrastructure, including our election system, is pretty fragile. It doesn't take much of a push to get a power outage. It doesn't take much of a push to get a system to break down. And that's clearly the case with our electoral system. And part of the problem is we only pay attention to it every 4 years. So we're in sort of a 3-month focus right now. We're all concerned about it. But I guarantee you, the day after the election, no one's going to care about it. And so we've got to, if you will, take advantage of this, but also at the same time, make it a more important national priority. For example, we have 16 areas of strategic importance in our cyber domain, and voting's not one of them. So airlines are, but not voting. And so it may be time we treat voting a little more seriously.
Emma, you wanted to chime in.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Fred's comment and to endorse it, because I think when you have a personalist regime like President Putin in Russia, which is very erratic, we're not sure what decisions he's going to make, who he's going to involve in that decision-making process, then your situation becomes even harder to predict, because we have no idea which way it may turn.
Emma, I wanted to ask you about the sanctions against Russia, why they were started, and what will the new president have to consider when deciding whether to continue them or not?
So the sanctions were started in response to the annexation of Crimea, which was part of the Ukraine, and also Russia's actions in eastern Ukraine. So that was predominantly, people obviously were concerned about the illegal annexation of a region in Ukraine, and also Russia's military presence in the Donbass region, which is to the east. Now, the distinguishing feature of these sanctions is that they're sanctions against individuals. So they're not sanctions like, for example, we had under Iraq, which dominated and tended to target, people more broadly, the society more broadly. So what the Obama administration's done is very much target particular individuals, oligarchs in particular, members of the army, right? And essentially is try to ensure that they can't get access to Western credit, that they can't travel abroad, that their children can't travel abroad, and that essentially, they become sort of pariahs internationally. So it's very hard to, and Lee would be able to second me on this, to measure the influence of sanctions and to essentially understand what role they're playing and how effective they've been. But I think in the case of Russia, what we can say is that given that the ruble's fallen, right, given that there's economic strain more broadly in Russia, that the sanctions have been one contributing factor to a larger malaise that has been going on economically. Now, one of the ways that we can understand that is if that you see, for example, how much capital flight is leaving Russia. It's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, there was the New Yorker article a couple of weeks ago about Deutsche Bank and people basically selling and trading stock in one day in order to move their money out and pay 5%, right, in order to get their money out of Russia. So that proves to you that they're prepared to lose 5% on several million is quite a lot of money, right? So you're actually prepared to lose that in order to go ahead. So I think from my perspective, the new president, whoever that will be, if they want to strengthen the transatlantic partnership, they're going to have to keep Europe involved and as a supporting structure in the sanctions regime, because it's been this relationship between the US and Europe that's enabled, I think, these sanctions to work to the degree that they have. But sorry, Lee, go on. But I was just going to say, it's really an interesting situation that they're set up, right? That essentially they're hoping that Putin will stop his military adventures if he has to pay through his economy, right? But so far, it doesn't look as though he's at all interested in doing that the military adventures are more important than the national economy.
Yeah, and just to support what Emma is saying, the distinguishing characteristic of these sanctions is that there was agreement between the United States and Europe in their implementation. And they affect, as Emma was saying, individuals and also to a certain extent particular entities inside Russia. And so these are sanctions that are actually biting. And by the way, they come at some significant cost, particularly to US European allies, especially Germany, who pay a significant price because they have so much more trade and investment in Russia than the United States, for example, does. And right now, the future of the sanctions is formally tied to the full implementation of the Minsk II agreements, which are fundamentally observed in the breach. And the idea that we will get to a full implementation seems quite distant at the moment, as US and Russian relations are probably at their worst point since the Cold War.
I wanted to bring up East Asia, Adam.
Sure.
What do you think is the biggest security issue in East Asia that we're not hearing about from these presidential campaigns? Why aren't we hearing about it? And then if I can tack on, we have a question from Twitter. Will our position of strategic patience toward North Korea shift anytime soon if Hillary is elected?
Well, Joe, that's a very, very important question. It's one of tremendous salience. And I think I can even segue from the previous line of questioning, where one of the trends of the last couple of years has been an attempt by the US and its partners to tighten sanctions on North Korea. One of the reasons why you want to opt for sanctions is because alternatives are far less attractive. So for example, kinetic conflict is something that everyone wants to avoid, but they also require that you play a longer game and be patient and hope that over the medium to long term, they have the coercive effect that you hope for. Yet at least over the last year, they don't seem to be having the kind of effect that they were designed to as far as it concerns North Korea's behavior. We have a record set on the number of missile tests in North Korea just since January this year. We have the first time on record, well, absolutely the first time, that North Korea has tested 2 nuclear weapons in the same year. And this is a major issue. And we see this confluence of several disturbing trend lines, both qualitatively in terms of North Korea's capabilities, but also quantitatively. So to go back to the first question, I would actually say that North Korea needs to be at the top or near the top of the next president's security inbox. You asked, why is it not receiving the attention it deserves? I thought it was going to on Tuesday at the vice presidential debate when the moderator asked a question explicitly and directly about North Korea and nuclear proliferation, but within the span of 12 or 15 seconds, the candidates had managed to turn that to a discussion of Trump Foundation versus Clinton Foundation, tax returns, and issues that were very much off point. And so there are a couple of reasons for that. I think politics tends to be caught up in the crisis of the moment and also threats close to home. And sometimes we lose sight of the longer term strategic issues that only will really become major concerns of the average voter once something bad, very bad, has already happened. And also these are complicated issues. They don't make for easy sound bites.
Anyone else want to jump in? We do have a question from the audience. What will the U.S. position towards the UK be once they've pulled out of the European Union? Will it depend on how badly they pull out, or will the US leave the UK behind? Who would like to jump in on that one?
I think that may be mine. Well, first of all, there's still tremendous uncertainty, notwithstanding Prime Minister May's announcement about a March triggering of the exit clause. As well as the Labour Party's complicated position with respect to staying in and staying out. So I think internally, inside the UK, it's still not clear the direction they're going to move. It is clear that it's going to be difficult, probably close to impossible, for the UK to negotiate the kind of deal its leaders promised in advocating for Brexit. That is very clear, and in particular, the desire somehow to remove or limit the ability of non-British citizens to live and work in the UK is an issue that those who want to pursue Brexit are going to have to look at very, very seriously, because there are more Brits who live outside of the UK than outsiders from the EU who live inside the UK. In terms of the US relationship, I think the Obama administration has set the tone, which is effectively to hug the UK during this process. The referendum took place. The UK is going to honor the results of the referendum in one way or another, but it's not the United States' job to punish the UK, and in fact the relationship is strong and important on a variety of levels, strategically, in terms of the fact that the UK is one of a small number of militarily capable nations inside Europe. Also, its diplomatic importance is significant, and any splits between the United States and the UK serve to the detriment of US foreign policy more broadly. So I think you'll see the United States privately trying to encourage the UK to move in a smart direction, but publicly maintaining the historical special relationship.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think where the tension might arise is around the migration question and the number of migrants that are currently in Europe. So the tension may be more between the EU and Britain than Britain and the United States, because there are so many migrants in Germany in particular. How is Britain going to cope with that? How many migrants is it going to accept? What sort of player is it going to be on this tragedy, which is a massive scale that we haven't seen for 50 years? And so it is going to have to adapt and think about how it's going to be a team player in that regard.
I wanted to shift to humanitarian issues. While the war in Syria is receiving global attention, Clemence, you've been studying the situation in South Sudan. Can you describe what's going on and what challenges it will present to the new president?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think that South Sudan is suffering in a way from the fact that it's definitely not the only humanitarian crisis on the agenda right now. So I think it would come, at the back of the list. But it's one of the top 4 countries that has over 1 million refugees. And in terms of civilian casualties, there are no exact figures, but we're guessing between 50,000 and 300,000 civilian deaths in a country that has half the population of Syria. So it gives you an idea in terms of magnitude of the crisis. In terms of the future US policy, if we look at the present and past US policy, the US spent over $11 billion since 2005 on South Sudan. Some people say that it was the midwife of the new nation. And now look at the result. It's definitely not a success. The current US policy on South Sudan is, I would say, one way to put it, is not very sound. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Beyond the implications for South Sudan itself, it has implications for the entire region. So should this crisis go on, it's going to destabilize the entire region. Yeah.
Why do you think it's not getting enough attention now?
Well, there are so many other crises. I mean, Syria is on the top of the agenda. Brexit garners a lot of attention as well. Yeah, and there is no easy exit out of this situation. It's one of the top humanitarian crises in the world, but there is no easy answer.
Can you maybe describe a little bit about the process of humanitarian intervention work in a situation like South Sudan, and how might the next president handle it differently?
Yeah, I think the humanitarian intervention in South Sudan is symptomatic of wider issues that you can find in other contexts, in other countries as well, where aid workers, so for example, be it in Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, where aid workers are not safe, where international humanitarian law is not respected, and where it's extremely difficult to reach the populations in need.
If you were to contrast the U.S. Response, or the public response to Darfur in, say, 2005 and 2006 to the current saliency of South Sudan, it's a pretty strong contrast. You had in the United States kind of a cross-partisan, actually religious-based effort to stimulate a strong U.S. effort. It didn't really materialize in exactly the way that one might have hoped, but there was somehow room to talk about this issue, and it became one of the major issues. Today it's crowded out by a whole range of other issues, and it's in the framework of, again, a fundamental disagreement about what the United States ought to be doing, is capable of doing, can afford to do, and in particular on these, if you'll pardon the phrase, second-tier issues, or issues that don't go directly to the perceived U.S. national security interest.
Emma?
Yeah, I was interested in what Clémence thought about the sort of apathy around the region because of what happened in Darfur and because of the enormous amount of effort that was put in, because everyone was recognizing it as a genocide. We had been through Rwanda in 1994, again in Yugoslavia and Srebrenica. So there was this sense of, we really need to do something about this situation. And we were still very vibrant and thinking about this. So I wonder to what extent your feeling is that there's apathy because of we'd invested time there, or is it just, as Lee said, a kind of more second-tier phenomena that the US doesn't have much interest in?
I think it's interesting that Lee mentioned Darfur, because that was back in 2005 and 6, and that's right when you had the comprehensive peace agreement that finished the war between North and South Sudan, right? So there was this idea that there was huge momentum on Darfur, and that we had just solved the major issues between Sudan and South Sudan. And now we're 10 years later, and we have situations actually, when you look at the nature of the humanitarian intervention in South Sudan, you've got safe havens that remind us a lot of Rwanda and other contexts. Exactly. So I think there are a lot of other issues on the agenda, and that, of course, the country is suffering from it. The civilians are suffering from it, and there is no easy exit. And this is a country where a conflict that is not easy to analyze. It's not black and white. You don't have one ethnic group against another, even if it's portrayed this way in the media often. So people are a bit confused, is it a genocide, is it not a genocide? And now we are a bit more careful about using such terms, because we have seen that actually, it's pretty useless.
So we are on the air. I just want to remind everyone you're listening to a special live panel discussion from WFIU and the School of Global and International Studies. You can submit your questions for our panelists on Twitter at WFIU News. And we do have an audience with us as well. We have another question from the audience. This is open to anyone who'd like to chime in. Do you see collective security and mutual defense playing a larger role in current and future international conflicts?
I'll say a few words until Adam fixes what I say. Well, look, it's not within the capacity of any single country, even one as economically strong and militarily capable and otherwise in enterprising as the United States, to address these problems. And even if it were, it may not be something that the United States would want to or should do. So in general terms, by the way, and it's not just military intervention, we should be talking about these other ways of influencing and shaping events, whether it's economic diplomacy through sanctions or development assistance or other just plain old diplomacy. Mm-hmm. These are almost always more effective when you're working with others. A lot of this will depend on the effectiveness of the UN. We just have news of a new UN Secretary General. The role of the UN has been, I'd say, somewhat diminished in recent years. The UN is straining to be able to meet the demands that have been created by this unprecedented refugee crisis. So these are all reasons to want both international institutions and other countries as partners in dealing with the range of issues, whether they're hard security issues or whether they're humanitarian crises.
Adam, you want to? Yeah.
Sure. I'll say a few things, and I'll go from general maybe to talking a little bit about East Asia. But I think one of the stories that's not often told in the headlines, particularly in the 21st century, is the extent to which nations just have incredible and deep shared interests in maintaining the open sea lanes, freedom of navigation, stability of the international order, which serves, in most cases, nations pretty well. And so I think that's a really, really important question. Before we get to the issue of whether or not it's going to directly shape the way that wars are fought, I think it's at least in East Asia playing, at least on the margins at this point, an increasingly important role in the way that nations, particularly the United States, think about deterrence. We see this in a tightening interoperability between the US military and key allies, particularly Japan, Australia, South Korea. Some in the US have called for basically an Article 5 type agreement between Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington. Whether that happens or is politically feasible remains to be seen, but as North Korea becomes more of a clear and present danger, that may happen. But it's also, we see nascent multilateralization among Southeast Asian countries and with Japan and the United States. It's also important to note that the US and China as well, Japan and China, China and every country in the region have a lot of shared interests. So I would like to see far more multilateralization of cooperation, including China and other players in the region.
A question from Twitter. How will our foreign reliance on energy affect US foreign policy in regions like the Middle East?
Well, it's a question not just about the US reliance, but I'd say a broader group of countries, the West's reliance on imported sources of energy. The truth is that the United States is more or less a net exporter now of energy, and for a variety of reasons, but not the least of which is new natural gas deposits, which are being developed. And I think energy independence, so the holy grail of U.S. foreign policy for a long time, and particularly in the public imagination, is really requires thinking about this in a much more broader gauge way, which is that the United States may be more or less energy self-sufficient, but its allies definitely aren't. And so their circumstances really depend on the ability to get access to energy, either imported from the Middle East, for example, or maybe from Russia too. So the way in which this issue is refracted really depends on the neighborhood you're in, and it remains a concern for the United States and its allies, whatever the U.S. Individual position is.
Can I just ask what is more of a question, but let me preface it with an observation and then see if you agree or not? Because what's striking is how little the issues we're talking about here really are part of the campaign. So like you mentioned, North Korea almost got a moment in a debate and then got beaten out because of the important issue of foundations and taxes. Or, we've talked about Syria in the campaign, it seems like largely in terms of either refugees and how they're affecting the United States, whether they should be admitted. If you think of even the critical issues that have been encountered during the Obama administration, the Edward Snowden disclosures about NSA surveillance, about not US citizens and people around the world provoked lots of controversy. I don't think there's been hardly a mention of that. And so I'm just curious whether my fellow panelists either agree, are foreign affairs really being ignored in this debate other than in the most domestic sense? And is that unusual if it is?
No, it's not unusual. In general, the famous Clinton campaign, first President Clinton campaign quote, which was, "It's the economy, stupid." It's never unusual that people are focusing in the United States, in any case, on domestic issues. But I would say, actually, and of course, campaigns are always terrible places in which to develop a refined view of what foreign policy ought to be. And this campaign is a particularly good example of that. But I would say, to a certain extent, and particularly in the degree to which the outcome of this campaign is turning on the perception of whether a leader is got the temperament to be president, that in a certain respect, in the broadest sense, foreign policy is playing a significant role in terms of the quip about Twitter and nuclear triggers. So I think the responsibility that the president has and the ability of a person to make reasoned analytical decisions is actually, maybe in some respects, higher visibility than in the past. And one of the ways in which President Obama has been criticized, but also I think praised, is for being a person who's very cool-headed and analytical in making decisions and not feeling the need to thump his chest and look tough for the sake of toughness. Now that's been a position for which he's been criticized, but also praised.
Yeah, I would add to that I think that you can see in the Trump campaign a kind of diminishing around the talk about foreign affairs over time, because one, Donald Trump has exposed that he doesn't know certain things, but also that he makes very black and white statements, for example, about what he would deal with a complex problem like ISIS. So I think that the campaign strategy has also been to move him away from those discussions and keep him very much in that domestic field. And I think to a large extent then Clinton has had to respond to that. And maybe she would have talked more about foreign policy, but she's in this same sort of fenced-in gateway that it's all about domestic issues.
Adam, did you want to jump in?
I would just add one final point, and I agree with what both of my colleagues have said. And that it's absolutely across the board. Look to recent history. Foreign policy is not typically the way to the American voter's heart in contexts like this. But I would offer one caveat. That fundamentally is maybe not something new, but the extent to which this campaign has not been so much about policy as it has been about personality is something that, at least if you imagine a continuum, is something that is fairly remarkable. At the end of the day, there are only 24 hours in it.
Fred, maybe we can go back to some cyber security issues. The United States is increasingly concerned about terrorist groups like ISIS using the internet for recruitment. What can be done about that, and how are different countries responding to that problem?
Yeah, it's a really vexing issue because, if you will, the internet has sort of changed the equation about all of cyber. In other words, whether it's cybersecurity or whether it's freedom of speech or whether it's a way of engaging, recruiting, training, informing adherents of terrorist movements, the internet suddenly made it possible to do without leaving home. You don't have to travel to do it. It's one of the reasons why you might expect that Russian intelligence and others would like it as a way of dealing with the US, because you don't have to infiltrate an agent, you don't have to move them there. And for ISIS, it's been a particular gift in that it is a way to reach people in both the sort of recruiting sense of a way of portraying a message, making it as attractive as possible, but also a way of coordinating your recruits, of informing them, of training them, of giving them the information they need to do damage. And it's tremendously challenging to US values, because on the one hand, we spent a lot of time, especially in this administration, going around the world talking about freedom of speech on the internet and how critical it is. And we've taken very critical stances towards, for example, the Chinese and Saudi Arabia and other countries, because they did not adequately protect freedom of speech, particularly for dissidents or for people who were speaking unpopular things. On the other hand, now we're asking our own internet giants, our own large companies who are engaged in providing internet services, particularly social media, to either block certain speech or to report it to the government. And it's left the United States and some of its partners, certainly some of its Western allies, in kind of a difficult position to be in, so that we say, look, we believe free speech should be protected, but only up to a point, and how we define that point is something we don't have a lot of common agreement on, particularly with countries like China or countries which are typically crack down on the use of the internet for dissent. So it's not an issue that's about to go away anytime soon. And in fact, technological means, whether to block content you don't like or to identify it and watch it, have not been terribly successful. I mean, it's big and it's fast changing and it's accessible by so many people that it's very difficult to think that we're going to use any form of traditional means in order to identify and block content we don't like.
Emma?
I was wondering, Fred, you could probably speak to this better than us, but I'm always intrigued by where the law is on this, because it seems to me that the internet has gone forward in an incredible way, and the law is sort of back here, figuring out what to do, how it's going to cope with these issues around free speech, around hate speech, you know, what we block, what we don't block. And I wonder what battles are happening both sort of in the international legal system and domestic legal system about how you deal with these things.
Oh, I was hoping you were going to answer that.
Yeah, no.
question.
I thought you may answer it, because I mean, I have no idea where the legal line is, and it is a curious one, because I think there are people out there trying to struggle and figure it out.
Well, I think it's safe to say that law almost always lags behind reality, and in an environment as fast changing as the internet, it lags even farther behind. I mean, maybe decades, as a matter of fact.
Right.
And you know, we've had the challenge in both directions. I mean, on the one hand, many countries have said to us, particularly I think of Secretary Clinton, who was a major champion of the importance of free speech online, of human rights online, that, you know, the First Amendment is just a local ordinance. It just applies in the United States. It doesn't apply anywhere else. And so we can't really tell other countries, you have to follow the First Amendment, because it's limited to US territory. On the other hand, it's now challenging as to whether we can follow the First Amendment and still take seriously these challenges, because the First Amendment is largely it's largely based on the notion, not that speech can't hurt, but that speech can't do enormous damage. And so therefore we make it very hard to ban or prohibit or use a prior restraint with speech. And we make it very hard to recover for damage caused by speech. On the other hand, there are exceptions to that. A very widely recognized one, and one that is almost universally condemned online, is child pornography. And almost all service providers, social media, email providers, and so forth, scan their networks. If they identify child pornography, they both block it and they report it to the local authority in whatever country they're in. And again, there's very broad agreement. China and the US stand almost side by side on their agreement about the problem of child pornography. Child pornography, however, is recognized by the Supreme Court as an exception to our traditional First Amendment jurisprudence. We don't have that clear exception for, say, ISIS.
Yeah.
So we have an exception for what we call a true threat. If I make a threat against you in a way that is instrumental, it would actually look like either I want to carry it out or I'm helping someone else carry it out, that type of speech might be able to be regulated. But soliciting people who don't like a government to join together to dissent against that government, traditionally that's what the First Amendment has protected. And so it's been a real challenge, and one in which not so much argued in the courts as in academic papers and newspapers, about how we can, consistent with the First Amendment, target, for example, recruiters, proponents of terrorist causes who they would describe as freedom fighters.
Yeah.
So just one quick follow-up questions in terms of warfare. If the U.S. has the intelligence to stop cyber attacks, will the next president have to decide how to use these attacks against enemies?
Yes, in fact, I think one of the hardest questions the next president will have is about how aggressive to be in cyberspace. I think there's little question the US probably leads the world, or is in the small tier of countries that leads the world in the ability to do both cyber offense and cyber defense. And in fact, President Obama said this quite recently in response to Russia, that Russia would be wise to consider before it takes many more steps about targeting voter registration databases, that we are the preeminent authority in cyberspace. There is a challenge here, however, which is we are also one of the most open societies in cyberspace as well. And it's very difficult to defend an open society. It's really easy if you just take people offline. If you just say they're not going to be online, then you really don't have to worry about protecting them nearly so much. We are, of course, so open. We're so convenience-driven. We do so much of our shopping, our purchasing, our banking, the vast majority of stock trading, all done online. And therefore, it makes us intrinsically vulnerable, not because we're not competent, but because the attack surface is just so big, we can't defend it all. Mm-hmm. And I think that's going to be a challenge for the next president to say, are we in fact going to see legislation or executive orders that are going to start taking things offline in an effort to protect them? So it will be both the offensive use of cyber attacks, but also the defensive measures we take as a nation.
Adam, I know you brought up a little bit about warfare and military earlier on. Did you want to follow up on that a little bit too?
Well, I'm not saying this to be snarky, but the way the question was framed, I think implicit, at least please correct me if I misinterpret it, but it suggests that the U.S. is not already engaged in some of these activities, and I'm not in a position to comment on that or know the answer, but it's certainly an important question, and I just agree with Fred that these issues are only going to get more complicated, and our legal institutions need to keep up, or at least get somewhere around 2005 pretty soon.
Good point. We have a question from Twitter. What do you believe is the role of climate change or related environmental issues in humanitarian crisis? And Clements, would you like to take that one?
Yeah. Well, so obviously both war situations and climate change reinforce each other. For example, if I take the example of South Sudan, the fact that you've got hundreds of thousands of people in one same IDP camp who need firewood to cook the food that the UN provides them with is going to increase desertification, and it's going to create as well a protection issue because those people need to go out and they need to be protected. So I think in war context we can clearly see the intersection of both those issues. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, Clemence, you would know that, obviously the drought that was happening in Darfur was really one of the factors that led to the conflict, that you have these settled people and then you have nomads and they're trying to share their space and realizing that they can't share it because there aren't enough resources left. So that was a huge factor in the sort of origins of the conflict itself. And then the inadequacy of the aid getting to that region in order to cope with it.
I'd just add a quick point that climate change really interacts with a lot of the issues we tend to think about when we think about security, particularly in the non-traditional security domain. Displaced persons, refugees, water security. In the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, there are a number of island nations that are at very low elevation and may cease to exist within the next couple of decades. And these are all issues that we should be able to cooperate on addressing because we all have a stake in the ultimate outcome.
We're down to about 5 minutes left in our program. We do have another question from the audience we want to get to. How essential are overseas U.S. military bases to national security, and how have their roles changed over the years? Adam, maybe?
I spoke on this issue a little bit. I'm wondering if someone wants to tackle NATO directly.
Well, sure, but we should talk about East Asia too.
Okay.
Maybe I'll pose a question for you there. But the U.S. physical military presence in Europe and in NATO is much reduced from what it was during the Cold War, when the United States and its NATO allies had more than 500,000 troops on either side of the inner German border. So there is not this kind of tripwire system in Europe that it was meant to deter either side from a provocation. As it stands now, the United States is sort of changing the complexion of its military posture in Europe. It's maintaining bases in Germany, but at a much reduced rate, and it uses Germany really as a jumping off point for other kinds of military operations. The United States is also, in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, taken some steps together with NATO allies to pre-position military equipment as well as reasonably small, but much larger than anybody would have imagined, units on the states that border Russia and perceive a threat within the NATO alliance, in order to make the Article 5 promise that attack against one is attack against all credible, in the hope that this will deter further Russian adventurism.
No, sorry, I was just to add to what Lee said, that these units that they agreed, I think, in the Warsaw Summit in July, that these 3 units would be put in the Baltic states and in Poland, and that they would consist of soldiers from different countries that would serve there. And obviously, from the Russian perspective, this is again a concern and perhaps a sign that NATO is expanding in the region. But really, it is a response very much to the invasion of eastern Ukraine.
Adam, we have about 3 minutes left. But
sure, I'm happy to jump in here. We could have spent the whole session talking about these issues. And so one of the really, really important things that I think has emerged from both the public discourse but also the campaign is a reassessment of how important these alliances truly are, to not just maintaining U.S. leadership in the abstract, but ensuring that we have a stable, prosperous international society. And so just to go back to my earlier point, the alliance system should not be thought of as charity, as though we're giving a gift, and therefore they should have to pay for it. First, and most importantly, in Japan and South Korea, they pay significantly for it, multiple billions of dollars a year, both to what's called host nation support, to support U.S. troops there, but also in terms of footing most of the bill for new base construction, modernization, fortification, and other things. Stability in this region, particularly in East Asia, but also Europe, is in the direct U.S. interest. If you fast forward 10 years, 4 of the world's top 5 economies will be in this region once India jumps into the mix. Of course, China and Japan are already number 2 and number 3. They're also critical for deterrence, forward deployed presence, something that Hillary Clinton mentioned in a very famous foreign policy article in 2011 on the rebalance, is one of the core aspects of U.S. Asia-Pacific strategy. So by bolstering deterrence, they deter the likelihood of a conflict, and also by being there in the event that a crisis emerges, they reduce the cost of engaging.
Thank you very much. We are out of time. Thanks again to our panelists. If you missed any part of this discussion, the audio will be archived at WFIU.org, and full video of the discussion will be online later this week at broadcast.iu.edu and through sgis.indiana.edu. Thank you to our live and broadcast audience and the Indiana University School of Global and International Studies. With producer Drew Dodlin, I'm Joe Wren. Have a good night.